LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, part 2 of my conversation with Nate Silver. If you haven't listened to the first part of my conversation with Nate, you should go ahead and do that now. In that episode, we discussed Nate's journey from poker to politics and back again. Today, we're getting to the heart of his new book, On the Edge, his gonzo journalistic study of a group he calls The River. These are the risk-taking rationalists who come to dominate Wall Street, venture capital, and Silicon Valley. Nate considers himself to be a member of this tribe, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have critiques of the river. We'll get to those a little later in our conversation. But I began by asking him, what can we learn from the river? How should we apply this worldview to our lives? Is probabilistic thinking a kind of superpower?
Look, I think it should be a pretty ordinary power, right? Because in some ways, we engage with it all the time in fairly intuitive ways. One example I like giving is if you go to a dinner party and you're seated across from somebody who you don't know and you are trying to have a conversation with, you actually probably behave quite probabilistically in what I would call a Bayesian reasoning from Bayes' theorem kind of way, where you start out and you ask some softball questions. You don't want to offend them. And then maybe you found that that you grew up in the same hometown, you root for the same sports team and whatever else. And you have some interests in common. And there's a kind of feeling out process that takes place all the time with respect to human behavior. And the difference here is that that's the thing that we do repeatedly. We have interactions every day with other human beings. I mean, even things if you look at how people, carve out space in an elevator or things like that. I mean, everyday repeated things, we actually are, I think, often quite probabilistic in our thinking and very intuitive about it. And the key, I think, is to take things like elections and be willing to make the leap to treating them as being part of some larger, uncertain distribution of events, understanding we'll only get to experience one every 4 years, but being in some ways humble enough to understand that we have imperfect, incomplete information. And if you actually have to make bets for a living or you actually build models, then you will get humbled sooner or later, right? And that experience, I think, is something people could extrapolate from.
We'll be right back.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. TIAA makes you a retirement promise, a promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. Learn more at TIAA.org/promises pay off.
One of the first pieces of advice I took from the book is that we should all take more risks. Most people have a tendency to say, the probability of starting a business or making an investment or what have you, the probability of that turning out well is low, so I'm just not going to do it. And I think you would say, well, if you have a decent chance of success and the rewards are huge if you succeed, and you can roll the dice many times in your life, then the math is on your favor to take those risks. You've got positive expected value. Would you say, broadly speaking, that most people should be more comfortable taking more risks?
Yeah, I'd say 90% of people should take more risk, at least in kind of a career financial basis. I'm not talking about risky personal behaviors necessarily either way.
Right.
You meet some people in the river who are too far the other direction, probably. SPF, for example. Right. But yeah, look, the way I think of it is that we have lots of evolutionary and cultural training where we're growing up in kind of a subsistence economy where we don't have the type of abundance that we have today, don't have the types of safety nets that we have today, potentially. Where if you get some type of infection as a caveman, you're going to die probably, right? And now you go to the doctor and you get charged too much by your insurance, but you'll be okay. Shifting away from a scarcity mindset goes against people's gut instinct a lot of the time, and often does involve being more risk taking. And there have been studies. So Annie Duke is a former poker player.
We had her on the show.
Okay,
which is
cool,
wonderful. Yeah.
She has a book called Quit, which is about how you should, if you're on the fence, you should change. You should quit.
Yes.
Look, I'm just my personal life. I'm thrilled that I kind of like quit this track I was on with with the big corporate employer and decided to kind of go back out on my own, right? I mean, it was unambiguously the better decision. If I was on the fence and wanted to find some other substitute for ABC News for some point in time. Most people, studies find, like when they make a big change, they wind up being happy about it.
There's a wonderful study by Stephen Levitt, right, the economist, in which he actually convinced a bunch of people volunteered to make major life decisions about whether to like stay in a job or a relationship based on a coin toss, right?
Yeah.
And found that the people who made the change were happier on average, right? It's a fantastic research.
Look, I will make minor life decisions with a coin toss. Am I getting Thai food or Indian food for lunch, right? If I can't decide, I'll just flip a coin, right? Tails is Thai, heads is Indian. I haven't made major life course decisions that way, but apparently when people do and they flip the coin for change, then they wind up being happier.
So a second piece of advice that really stuck with me is that you say it's a good exercise to estimate probabilities with numbers, that the act of making guesses improves our thinking, I think. Why is that so?
Look, ultimately in poker, you have to decide if you're trying to decide whether to call a bet that might be a bluff. It's at the end of the day, a mathematical calculation, right? What's the size of the bet relative to the size of the pot? And how likely am I to have the best hand and that my opponent's bluffing? So poker kind of forces you to quantify everything. In the book, you meet people like effective altruists and rationalists who literally try to like quantify, like, what is the value of the life of a dog relative to a human being, right? Or an orca relative to an elephant or an ant or whatever else. And like all models, I mean, models can be bad models and can be taken too far. But look, at the end of the day, we have to make probabilistic decisions, and probabilities mean a number from 0 to 100%, right? And so therefore, like, you can window dress it, but you have to be willing to, at some point, make this guess in the form that takes the form of a number, basically.
Meanwhile, though, you also say that we should trust our guts, which would seem to be at odds with this idea of thinking probabilistically. But in fact, it's really not at odds, right?
We should trust.
Can you explain that? Yeah.
There's an important qualifier, which is you should trust your gut when you have a lot of life experience with the situation.
Right.
If you've played thousands and thousands of hands of poker, is the most salient example in the book, then you're picking up on like a lot of implicit behaviors that you might not be able to put into words in terms of whether someone has a strong hand or a weak hand, right? The micro expressions on their face, the way their heart is beating, if you can see their heartbeat in their neck or things like that. Look, if you look at large language models like ChatGPT, they also understand there's a lot of implicit information in communication that isn't contained just in the vector of a word or a token or whatever, right? That there's some more complicated way that we're perceiving the world and communicating that is not fully expressed by like words that we use in the English language. And like, I think a lot of communication is kind of the same way, right? We pick up implicit information from things that we can't quite quantify and fit into like our formal mathematical mental model, but which is nevertheless pertinent information that we learn through experience. If you're playing poker the first time, then don't trust your gut. In fact, an experienced player will try to trick you by giving off a reverse tell. If you're in a situation where it's a first of a kind situation, when we face the COVID-19 pandemic, unless you were around for the 1919 influenza pandemic, you don't really have any relevant experience. And you should probably slow down and be more deliberate in your thinking and not trust your gut instinct. I mean, our guts are really bad with exponentials and how fast exponentials increase, for example. So it's a qualified trust your gut for situations where professionally or personally, you have 5,000 hours plus of experience.
I was shocked to encounter on page 384 of your book the following statement: "I'm not a particularly calculating person." Right. So is that a reflection of this kind of trust of your gut response in areas in which you have a lot of experience and exposure?
I think so. For things like poker or writing, or maybe at this point, I've kind of had a relatively large number of different media iterations and careers. So yeah, it's in situations where I have more experience. And it's also thinking that one thing you learn from poker is that people spend a lot of time thinking about decisions that don't really matter very much. I mean, if you actually solve for like the game theory equilibrium of a poker hand, a lot of it involves what's called indifference, meaning literally that you have the same expected value by calling or raising or by calling or folding, for example. And so you should literally just kind of randomize your decisions, right? Which is kind of why I love Steve Levitt, big fan of his, but kind of why I think like the coin flips for big life decisions kind of gets it slightly backward, where it should be coin flips for small life decisions, right? I'm not somebody who worries a great deal if a friend cancels plans at the last minute, right? I'll find something else to do. But for things like big career choices, then I'll be more deliberate about planning.
I actually had to read years ago about the Iowa gambling task research in order to learn to trust my gut more deeply, which you write about in the book. But it's fascinating research, right? Because as it happens, our gut responses to situations, as you say, in which we have a lot of prior knowledge, is informed by a huge amount of pattern recognition and intelligence that comes from our brain and is kind of projected into this kind of visceral gut feeling that we have. Do you want to share a little bit about the Iowa gambling task? This really was kind of eye-opening for me.
The Iowa gambling task, I think it was maybe originally done with physical decks of cards, now it's usually done virtually, is where you can choose between 4 decks of cards, 2 of which have a negative expected value and are very risky, and 2 of which are positive expected value, or bets that you usually win if you reveal a card. And what the experiment found is that people, after some period of time, learn to distinguish the bad decks from the good decks, but they also do it subconsciously before they do it consciously. The way they move their mouse cursor, if you look at their pupils, they become fearful of the bad decks a turn or two earlier than they actually consciously say, oh yeah, that deck is bad. I found the positive expected value deck over here instead. And look, the experts I spoke to a guy named John Coates, who's a fascinating dude. He was ran a derivatives trading desk, I think at somewhere, Deutsche Bank or something, but had an academic background. He was like, boy, these traders are a bunch of freaks, right? They are very, very weird. And yet they're very good at what they do. At least some of them are. And so he went and became a cognitive neuroscientist. And so he has run a bunch of experiments on traders. And what he's found is that the more successful traders actually have a higher stress response as measured by things like testosterone, for example, which, by the way, mirrors what they have found in like Olympic level athletes. That Olympic level athletes have like a higher delta between their resting heart rate and their competitive full bore heart rate. So it's not a bad thing to be experiencing stress. And if you've been in high stress situations before, and the situation I experience it most often in is in poker, where I, once a month or so, I play a game that's a frankly pretty high stakes game where the money actually really matters. And when you've done that, now I've done it maybe 15 times or something, you kind of learn how to operate in this zone where you actually pick up more information, right? I mean, we have evolutionary training to deal with crises and deal with stress, and our bodies have a lot of feedback in situations where we are threatened. If you've ever been in like a life-threatening situation, you may have noticed that kind of time slows down a little bit. Some people actually think quite clearly in those situations, right? That's a evolutionary defense mechanism. With financial risk, like poker or trading, when you're trading equities or something, you're kind of simulating that physical risk, but your body actually has, for many people, the same stress response. When financial risk gets over a certain level, we respond to it as though it's actually interpersonal physical risk.
Right. And I love this observation that when we're under stress, we actually become more intuitive, not less intuitive. I mean, so that it's really an adaptive response. It's a high performance modality, right? It's like driving a high performance sports car at higher RPMs or something. Our heart's beating faster, our brain is maybe functioning better. As long as we don't, as you put it, let anxiety turn into a doom spiral, right? We do have to understand what's happening and not panic.
Yeah, no, look, one of the problems you face in poker is that if you feel a stress response and feel anxiety, you may actually betray that with your body, meaning give away tells potentially.
Yeah.
And there are some hacks to deal with this. I mean, the place where most people give away the most tells is in their neck, actually. That's where you see the carotid artery, whatever it's called. So, wearing a shirt like a hoodie that covers your neck, if you're in a high stakes game, if you have that tendency, you can do that, for example.
Which, by the way, I think should not be allowed. I think that like mirrored sunglasses and, I mean, what makes it so interesting to me as a game is the fact that it's Homo sapiens interacting and reading each other, right? And so I think people camouflaging themselves, to me, take some of the fun out of that.
So poker's a way more physical game than you would think. I mean, if you play poker, I mean, the act of paying attention and also concealing your behavior. I mean, normally, all the things I was talking about before about how like we actually are communicating in a multimodal way in all types of subtle ways. And like usually we want to send lots of signals to people in our environment to communicate with them, even non-verbally, right? In poker, you want to do exactly the opposite and turn all those things off. So having the composure to do that, plus the attentiveness, because poker can be hours of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror, is a term that's been applied to poker and other things. Paying attention at a high level is actually quite demanding. And if you're in a high stress poker situation, then you should probably scramble back to your hotel room and fall right asleep at the end of the day because you've just gotten over the finish line after using all your energy, basically.
This was a fascinating observation to me that actually just observing people intently takes an enormous amount of kind of physical focus and energy, you say. And that I think you said that if you have not had a good sleep and you're not in like your best kind of physical condition, you put less faith in your reads of other people and you start playing more mathematically. Was that right?
That's right. I mean, I think then you try to play more like the computer, because computers play pretty good, but they don't exploit traits they pick up in other human beings. I mean, and you can tell by when you are playing these high stakes games, you can see how elevated in some ways your perceptions become. That there's a lot of information that you pick up about how people's hands are moving and what their facial expressions are, and you're strategizing ahead, half a hand ahead, but when you're tired, that goes away. And in fact, you can sometimes have a tendency to self-sabotage, right? If you're hungry and you start thinking, I could go like get a little nice sushi dinner and have a half a glass of sake and then fall asleep, then believe it or not, I guarantee you'll find some way to like facilitate that by punting off money and busting out of the tournament.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. In the last 100 years, we've seen financial markets swing, new currencies come and go, decades of savings lost in days, all showing that a retirement plan without a guarantee, quite simply, isn't enough. So more than a retirement plan, TIAA makes you a retirement promise. A promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. A promise that pays off. Learn more at TIAA.org/promisespayoff.
Hey, I'm Michael Kovnat, host of The Next Big Idea Daily. The show is a masterclass in better living from some of the smartest writers around. Every morning, Monday through Friday, we'll serve up a quick 10-minute lesson on how to strengthen your relationships, supercharge your creativity, boost your productivity, and more. Follow The Next Big Idea Daily wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, let's take a turn and talk about Sam Bankman-Fried.
Yeah.
What an interesting piece of your journey. You really had some kind of extraordinary access to Sam Bankman-Fried that I imagine you didn't expect in different kind of critical moments of his journey. Let me just start by asking, does your heart break a little bit for Sam Bankman-Fried? How do you feel about kind of how this has played out?
No, I'm not sympathetic to him at all, because I gave myself a lot of chances to be sympathetic to him. And, he lied to a lot of people. He lied to me. I mean, the timing was great. And I could go and compare, my notes from the 5 conversations I had with him to the court transcripts from his hearing in New York when he was found guilty by a jury. So no, I mean, look, there are some similarities. I mean, his parents taught at Stanford. My dad actually taught at Stanford for a year when I was growing up, right? So, the house I lived in that year is probably a 15-minute walk from where SBF lived. Certainly, he speaks some of the same vocabulary that other Riverians speak and that I speak. But I think he was a pretty dangerous individual, and I think he surrounded himself with people who were, I don't know, drinking the Kool-Aid and too afraid to call him out on on this dangerous behavior.
And so you think the river does need to take ownership of him as a member, right? I mean, he certainly was a right.
For sure. I mean, look, when I first started writing the book, I mean, he was actually in the kind of first 10 or 20% of interviews that we did. We were just kind of like casting lines and interesting people who were across different domains in the river. But yeah, before long, like literally every subject the book covers, except poker. He's not a poker player, but he's involved in crypto and effective altruism. He was a major political donor, for example. He was an investor in Anthropic, one of the still leading AI labs. Top venture capital firms were investing in FTX. So yeah, I mean, he was the mayor, so to speak, or the kind of key network connector in the river, and it has to take ownership of him for sure. Now, his particular sub-niche, kind of more in the effective altruism space, I think in most parts of the river, you do have skin in the game, right? In poker, you're kind of a lone wolf. I mean, you literally, make or lose money by the quality of your decision-making, screened, of course, by a lot of luck. In effective altruism, then you don't, right? You're kind of running these abstract models of what's the best way to give to charity or how do we measure existential risk, but you don't really have a lot that's personally on the line. And so therefore, I think effective altruists, although admirable in many ways, don't have the bullshit detector that other people in the river have, right? And that BS detector makes up for a lot of other faults. People in the village also don't have it. But the EAs fell for, I think, a snake oil salesman and were insufficiently skeptical of Sam.
Right. And actually, and the VCs as well, right? And I think one observation you make is that you have seen so many Sam Bankman-Fried type kids in your life that you were not overly impressed with his intellect, and you think that basically a lot of people sort of misunderstood what was special about him. Is that fair?
Yeah, look, I mean, the typology of Sam, right? I mean, he's probably, neuroatypical a little bit, but, this kind of nerdy guy who's talking about expected value and things like that, right? And is into crypto and is into other weird stuff. I mean, I know a lot of people like that. And so I'm not so impressed as a default with somebody like that, for sure.
And do you think, so he told you that he felt scapegoated. And it does seem to me that actually the fall of Sam Bankman-Fried was psychologically useful for a lot of Americans, right? Right? Because there's a sense that like, oh, there are all these whiz kids running around making billions of dollars, doing this thing, building stuff on the blockchain that we don't understand. And I'd much rather think that they're a bunch of scammers and it's all just a fraudulent operation than think that I'm missing out on something or, don't understand something important about the way the world's changing, right? So it does strike me that there's been a pile on to sort of pillaring Sam Bankman-Fried in a way that he represents something more than just his actions.
I mean, I think that's fair, but I also think he did the crimes. He should do the time. You know what I mean? I mean, look,
yeah, sure.
The one time I felt sympathy for him, just the kind of strangeness of the situation where all of a sudden he thinks he's like going to be the next Elon Musk. I mean, he told people there was a chance he'd become a trillionaire, a chance he'd become president of the United States at some point. And this collapse happens kind of literally overnight. The reversal of fortune, which is 99% his fault, but like the reversal of fortune, you can still empathize with that as a human being. And I probably have some level of empathy as some other nerd that became kind of famous for nerdy things, right? I mean, that can be a weird position and you can become some token of someone's imagination. So in that moment, I felt some sympathy, but then you compare your notes after, 5 or 6 interviews I did with what he told, not what he told the court, where other people testified about what he said and how he behaved. And, you become less sympathetic in a hurry.
How do you feel about the effect that this has had on the effective altruism movement? we had McCaskill on the show, and
Yeah.
I thought he made a fair amount of sense. I agree with you about utilitarianism going too far. But do you think that the effective altruism movement has been tarnished through this Sam Bankman-Fried kind of downfall to a degree that is unfortunate, or do you think that it deserves the flack that it's gotten as well?
I think it deserves it. I think it's been a pretty rational updating process where it's not like, it's not like Will McCaskill has like lost his job or something like that. He's probably lost some status, some stature. Because look, I mean, if they're all about like risk assessment, the fact is that Sam was the single most important person in their life, and that Sam had lots of red flags from the get-go. Maybe crypto in general being a yellow flag at least, but like, Sam said lots of crazy things from the start. I mean, on the Bloomberg Odd Lots podcast, he basically described how some of his FTT tokens were Ponzi-like vehicles for speculative investing. He told the economist Tyler Cowen that he would basically flip a coin where the world gets destroyed half the time if you wind up having it 2x as good plus some epsilon amount the other half of the time. He clearly was unprepared for the inevitability of a downturn in Bitcoin, which is an inherently volatile asset, or at least is for the time being. He is a pretty bad assessor of risk, and they were a bad assessor of risk to have so many of their eggs in the Sam Bankman-Fried basket. So no, I do. And I think it speaks a little bit to like that lack of competitive skin in the game drive that is admirable in other parts of the river, I think. EA is a brand name associated with Will McCaskill and Toby Ord, and I have a lot of respect for Will and particularly Toby as individuals. I think they're very smart people, and I think EA has done net good for the world in terms of, in kind of a softer way, right? In terms of the fact that like Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and Warren Buffett, for example, are now giving away their fortunes and taking a fair amount of care to do so in ways that are more optimal, right? I don't think they'd call themselves EAs. Maybe that brand name has been tarnished now, but like that's a pretty huge net benefit for the world. Is like, people can call me whatever they want, but like the Gates Foundation has been good for society, for example. But the brand name is kind of a clever exercise, and it's all prim and proper. It's Oxford people and Princeton people and things like that. And so, yeah, I think if it's a kind of public relations war, then you get a few extra points off, I think, for having, it's not just a bad PR thing if it's partly like a marketing ploy to begin with.
And it seems like it's a bit of a cautionary tale, the downfall of FTX and the headwinds for effective altruism, of what happens when you take probabilistic thinking too far, right? I mean, in the sense that like one can say, okay, well, you flip a coin, as Sam Bankman-Fried said, and you can either destroy the world or have a world that's 2.1x better than our current world, right? And that's a coin that he would flip. Now that's partly seems to be a reflection of kind of what a tortured and unhappy person Sam Bankman-Fried was, right? Yeah, suffering from anhedonia and so on. But it's also just taking this mathematical kind of analysis and this utilitarian thinking to a preposterous extreme that in the end is dangerous and I think you would say like needs to be stopped and corrected.
No, I mean, look, there are a couple of things that happen. One of which is that for as much as Silicon Valley, et cetera, thinks of itself as being independent and contrarian, there was a lot of confirmation bias about Sam, right? Where, well, maybe this FTX seems a little bit sketchy, but look, Sequoia Capital is investing in him, and he's on a panel at the World Economic Forum with whatever, Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, and he's like hanging out with Tom Brady and shooting commercials, right? And invited to the Met Gala and things like that. And so there's a little bit of a bystander effect where everyone assumes that someone else did the due diligence and nobody did, actually, because it's not like these things. I mean, if I go back to like the interview that I did with Sam in February 2022 or January 2022, before he become like a convicted felon, there are lots of crazy red flags there, right? At the time he was riding high, so like it wasn't until I went back and, I mean, one of the nice things about a book is that you actually have a process where you get to see 3 years unfold and see how the world changes, and it's like a little microcosm of it. But there were lots of red flags in that interview that if he wasn't kind of, on the ascent, then people might have been more willing to call him out on that.
Well, the reason that I'm kind of a little bit disheartened that effective altruism has been sort of tarnished as much as it has, is that I feel like the message that McCaskill has and Toby, that, you know, we as a species are in the reckless adolescence of our development, arguably. We're all drunk in a station wagon with the pedal on the floor, chanting faster, 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 right? And there's one kid in the corner sheepishly saying, maybe we should slow down, right? And so I think that their argument, as I understand it, has been, hey, let's take at least 1 or 2 or 3% of our philanthropic giving to try to think proactively about, you know, long-term threats to our species. Which would include, you know, like biological threats. Like you pointed out, we have not logically invested in preventing the next pandemic as we should earlier in the conversation. So I think that at least some more long-term thinking does seem to be a good idea. You got pulled into all this, right? And this, a lot of the last third of your book gets deep into this. So where do you fall on our long-term prospects?
If we're giving EA blame for SBF, which I think we should give credit for some foresight for how big a deal AI would become.
Right.
Because it wasn't obvious, even to people in the industry, that these large language models would work as well as they would. It was kind of miraculous, in fact. By the way, I mean, pandemic funding and prevention's been a big cause area for EA and EA adjacent charity work as well. A lot of people in Silicon Valley actually understood in the early days of the COVID pandemic how exponentials work, and they were canceling meetings and taking Zoom calls and wearing masks before people in the village were, for example. So they have had some foresight in certain areas. And like you said, I mean, understanding that like a low probability, high impact risk or opportunity can have a very high or very negative expected value is certainly something that is hard for humans to address, right? Silicon Valley gets that. They understand that like a 1 in 50 chance of a startup that is worth 1,000x its investment is a fantastic bet. And if you're Andreessen Horowitz or something, you can have 5 funds that invest in 20 of these companies every year, you're kind of guaranteed almost to make a big profit eventually. But the downside of that, whereas like, you know, a 2% chance of an AI apocalypse or a 2% chance of a nuclear apocalypse in the next 10 years. Toby Ord's book thinks there's a 1 in 6 chance that humanity will fail to make it out of the next century intact. That does deserve like a lot of attention as a cause area.
So you probably did not expect to be going deep into the existential threat of artificial intelligence in your journey in writing this book in the last 3 years, but you did. You spent a lot of time talking with a lot of the heavyweights in the space. Where does your P-doom come out? How serious a threat do you think that we have as a species?
So I kind of punt on this question in the book. So I give a number because I believe in expressing uncertainty through numbers, but I give a range, which is 2% to 20%. One reason why I give a range, because there are very different definitions of this. Some people define it as like literally every species on life is physically wiped off the earth, whereas some people define it as more that we sacrifice control to the AI systems, right? That second definition, I think, is quite plausible, that we are no longer as much in charge of our destiny. Maybe it's the AIs plus a handful of extremely powerful human beings. But look, I talked to lots and lots of very smart people who have spent like way more time than me on this problem. And so to some extent, that range is deferring to them a little bit. Yeah. What we do know is that like these large language models progressed faster than anyone expected in kind of a miraculous way. And we don't fully know how they work, which is maybe unique to like any technology in human history, really, right? It's kind of back in the pre-industrial age of like magic almost. And so that inherently presents some danger, I think.
I mean, one of the things that worries me is that whereas with the threat of nuclear weapons, that there was a game theory dynamic that was working for our common interest in terms of mutually assured destruction. It feels like with AI development, we have a game theory dynamic that's working against our interests. That's more like the prisoner's dilemma situation where everyone is, I mean, we were talking with Bill Gates a few weeks ago on the show, and he said, yes, if there were a way to slow down a lot of people would be interested in that, right? Which
Yeah.
was his way of saying, like, effectively, yes, we should be slowing down our development of artificial intelligence, but there's no visible way that for us to apply any braking mechanism to this process because it's a global race with many different actors, some of whom are not friendly. And so it feels to me like the game theory dynamics are not necessarily operating in our favor here.
No, and the fact that like these AI labs are run by classic Riverian archetype personality types. And remember, people in the river are very competitive, right? Sam Altman is ferociously competitive. I think he'd probably admit that. And to ask a culture whose ideology is move fast and break things to proceed carefully. I mean, look, I actually happen to think that like OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google are all being run relatively well, right? But to put that much trust in the hands of a few CEOs who are these complicated, risk-taking, competitive people, even if very high IQ or whatever else, I, like a lot of people in the river, am a little skeptical of government intervention, but I think government has a responsibility to think carefully about regulation and what form that would take.
Meanwhile, though, you land at the end of the book in a surprisingly risk-tolerant position when it comes to AI. You say that if you were offered a button that would stop AI where it is today, you would not push it.
Yeah, although I give myself an out where I say I get another button opportunity to push it in 10 years.
Right.
And that's partly because technological development to date has had tremendous net benefits for human society, right? If you look at the example I gave is like, if you look at severe poverty in India, India's population has increased by 3x or something, and the number of people in severe poverty has declined by 3x, despite the population growth, for example. I don't think I have the right as like a, frankly, well-off Westerner to dictate for the rest of the world that we have to stop this technology because I'm living this kind of comfortable, cushy life, and I want to be risk averse necessarily. And I think we probably, there have been some good things. I mean, the fact that we've had, in my view, this kind of plateau in large language models, that the improvements have been pretty incremental since GPT-4. Claude seems to be maybe a little better in some areas. Google Gemini was kind of a little bit of a mess out of the gate. That's actually optimistic if you're worried about P-doom, I think, because it means that like we're not necessarily in a fast takeoff scenario, and that we'll have opportunities to intervene if things do get out of hand. But yeah, I think I still default to the prior of technology being net good. And, I don't want to have the God complex of like turning off this thing when we have so little information about it.
I also take your point that risk tolerance has been central to the American sensibility from the get-go. It's part of what has made this such an innovative and interesting and successful country. And that risk tolerance may prove to be essential to a better future.
Yeah, look, among other things, the book is about American exceptionalism, believe it or not. When you have a long book, you have a lot of sub-themes that work their way in. But it's not coincidental that Silicon Valley is in the United States. And by the way, it's not coincidental either that a lot of founders are immigrants, that they are people who seek this place out, seek America out, and seek Silicon Valley out on top of just being in America, because it's a place where risk is tolerated. And so it attracts crazy people, high IQ people, but it attracts talent like no other place on earth, despite all its flaws.
Do you hope that one of the impacts your book might have is cause people on the river to maybe adjust down their risk tolerance slightly? Is that part of what your journey has been about?
Yeah, look, so it may be that 90% of people are too risk averse, but because winning, again, this poker tournament of life or poker tournament of career and being at the top of the heap, being the CEO of OpenAI, like those people who almost by definition are risk-taking and maybe even like too risk-taking. So I hope there's some meeting in the middle here. In some ways, the river and the village, I think, both satisfy the other side's like worst critiques of it, right? A lot of founders are like vainglorious assholes, to put it kind of bluntly. And they can make very selfish bets that they rationalize as being in the best interest of society. And they can do things that they think are very rigorous, but are actually just kind of back of the envelope at best. So I don't want this bifurcation where we have like SBF on the one hand and the person who hasn't left their apartment since COVID on the other hand. I think we need, society needs people who are both risk-taking and risk-averse. There's probably some healthy ecology where there's some combination of that. But the fact that like all the risk takers are like concentrated in some spaces now and the other spaces are really risk-averse seems like a threat to like kind of genetic diversity of the species, so to speak.
Yes. Well, I think it's wonderful that as an ambassador of the river, you're coming across to the other side and encouraging both sides to maybe appreciate the wisdom from those less like them. So it's such an eye-opening book, and I'm so thrilled that the world's about to get to read it. And thank you so much, Nate, for being with us today. What an interesting conversation.
Thank you, Rufus. Great conversation, and I'm glad that you enjoyed the book.
Nate Silver's new book, On the Edge, is out now. If you're a member of The Village, you should pick up a copy at your favorite local bookstore. If you're in the river, you're probably going to want to buy a copy on Amazon. I also highly recommend Nate's Substack, Silver Bulletin. I'm a subscriber. There's a link in our episode notes. Speaking of Substack, we just launched one. It's called Book of the Day. And every day we share 5 key insights in audio and text from one of the smartest writers on the planet. It's a mini masterclass delivered straight to your inbox, and you can read or listen to it in the same amount of time it takes to play Wordle. Sign up today by visiting bookoftheday.nextbigideaclub.com or following the link in our show notes. Today's episode was sound designed by Mike Toda. Our executive producer and resident millennial villager is Caleb Bissinger. The Next Big Idea is a proud member of the LinkedIn Podcast Network. I'm your host, Rufus Griscom, and next week I'll be chatting with Maura Ahrens-Mealy about how to turn anxiety into a leadership superpower.
There is no great leader who hasn't been on what she will literally call the cliff of despair. But I do want to say that for my fellow travelers who have really tricky brains, it's actually your superpower.
See you then.